Hi, welcome to our session. We're excited you're here. I'm Eric Bursch. I'm responsible for Platform as a Service at Gannett in USA Today. We've really gone through a dramatic transformation in the last year, and really our session is focused on that change. We've coined this session how we brought shadow IT into the light. And that's part of an overall effort that we've undergone around building a platform for our future needs, our future technology needs. A lot of people come up to us and say, yeah, what is this new platform that you guys have built, and so on and so forth. I said, well, it revolves around three major things. Process changes that we put into place, a culture change inside of our organization, which is the toughest part of this execution, and then a tools change new tool set that we brought into the equation. So from a tools perspective, two very strong partners of ours that have helped us along this journey, Amazon and Chef, and we're going to be intertwining those conversations in the session today. So just quickly, just a little bit about Gannett, and you notice that I introduced myself as from Gannett in USA Today. It's always interesting reaction when I'm down in the vendor booth or in the vendor hall, and somebody's staring at my name tag and they see Gannett, and either they're mispronouncing Gannett or they really don't know what Gannett is, and then I have to say, oh, we're Gannett in USA Today, and then the light bulb goes on. But Gannett has 92 properties inside of the U.S. And I will put an asterisk next to that because yesterday we released news that we acquired additional properties which will fold into our network, which we're excited about. So the national brand inside of Gannett is USA Today. Everybody's heard that. It's an extremely strong national presence. Our other 91 properties consist of strong local community markets, some big ones like Arizona Republic, Detroit Free Press, Indianapolis Star. So we really feel that with that strong national and local mix, it gives us a strategic advantage over our competitive set. So I want to introduce these two gentlemen that are up on stage with me. Frank Hansen, who manages one of our Platform as a Service teams, and that team was responsible for designing and delivering this platform that we've introduced. And George Miranda, who is an evangelist from Chef, and you heard me say earlier, Chef's been a great partner in this journey. So I'm going to hand it over to George to get us started.
Great, thanks. So again, I'm George. I'm an evangelist at Chef. I'm a career infrastructure engineer, mostly on the systems side of the house, a little bit on the dev side, but primarily doing what most folks label as sysops. I started my career at Chef as a consultant, or what some folks would call a solutions engineer, which is to say that I've gotten to work with a really wide swath of Chef customers. And it's been really interesting because I've gotten to see a number of infrastructures in a very short amount of time, right? And I've very comparatively and quickly seen a number of application stacks and workflows, team dynamics, organizational structures, and seen them in different phases of implementation. I've also gotten to work with some of Chef's most successful and largest customers in various phases of their transformations. So I'm particularly thrilled to be able to help introduce Gannett's story of how they've been able to transform their IT organization and bring shadow IT into the light. But before we do that, we're going to start with the obligatory what is Chef slide, which is currently up on the screen. And so in a nutshell, right, Chef is an open source product. It's a configuration management framework. It has a focus on scalability and extensibility. There's cloud native integration for providers like AWS. There's a Chef server that you can use, right? The Chef server can be the central point, the central source of truth, distribute your code, et cetera. And all of that falls into the open source framework, and you can use all of those tools for free, and you can do some pretty amazing things with your infrastructure just with that open source tool set. But there's also a pretty rich enterprise ecosystem behind that as well. And the enterprise ecosystem includes a couple of things like a change management engine that has a very defined, specific workflow for introducing change and testing it, validating it, releasing it into production, and doing that in a safe, sane, and fast manner. There's an analytics platform, which is actually really, really interesting. The analytics engine is now challenging security to come into the light as well and leave behind some of the manual practices, right? Following a checklist, doing manual scans in production, and codifying those things, right? Doing them programmatically and automatically the way that devs and ops have started to do, right? And so we're bringing security into the fold of the DevOps discussions. And it's been really interesting to see that evolve because it's really, DevOps has inclusion as a core tenet. And we're starting to see that those programmatic approaches are rippling out into other parts of the organization. So it's not just your devs, and it's not just your ops, and it's not just security, it's the entire organization. And so really, when we talk about that programmatic approach, right, like how we do things quickly and automatically, we tend to label that as infrastructure as code, and that moniker is a little misleading because it's not really just about infrastructure as code and code as code, it's about everything as code. And we'll get to see some examples of that. But in its base form, right, infrastructure as code just means you've got full stack automation. But automation is just the first part. It's like the gateway process that gets you there. So I personally believe that DevOps is not this revolutionary brand new tool that has descended from the heavens. It's a silver bullet that's going to save us all. I think that DevOps is the next logical step as we improve processes and workflows, right? We've always been refining our practices in industry. And there have been a number of enabling technologies that have fundamentally transformed our behavior, as well as some market forces that have all just sort of pushed us in a direction where moving quickly makes sense. And I'll call them out because I think they make a lot of sense at reInvent, right? Like we're not talking about data centers, we're talking about cloud, right? And it's not about servers, it's about services. And it's been said on stage multiple times, and I'll say it again, right? Software is eating the world. Every company, even if they're not a technology company, even if that's not their core competency and focus, is a technology company, right? Because technology is that conduit to the consumer. And so we see that a number of organizations, not just IT organizations, but companies as a whole, are being challenged to figure out how to release software faster, safer, more securely, more reliably. And when you take a step back and you look at the entire Chef framework and tool set, really it's about giving you tools and processes to be able to get you there. I'm going to talk about Chef-style DevOps Kung Fu for a minute. And if you've never heard that term before, go ahead and Google it, Chef-style DevOps Kung Fu. And when you find it, what you're going to find is a really prescriptive set of practices that are basically Chef's way of saying, this is how you take a DevOps practice and move quickly, at velocity, safely with Chef as your primary tool set. And when you look at it, it almost seems like best practices, and I cringe when I hear the words best practices. Because I think the thing that best practices overlooks is that we don't just divine these things out of the ether, right? We don't sit down in a committee and figure out, hey, what are the right things that people should be doing? We look to see what are the patterns of success, right? What have we seen work different places? And when we put those all together comparatively, right, the thing that we distill out are a set of good practices. And those good practices are a guide to help you figure out, well, what is the best practice for my particular organization and my particular workflow? Which brings me to the DevOps success journey. We talk about this a lot at Chef. And the DevOps success journey, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more nuance and a lot more detail than what's on the slide. But at a high level, right, it's basically the set of milestones and markers, things that we see culturally in organizations and technologically, right, that enable you to move at that fast pace required in continuous delivery, do it safely, and be able to move at that speed without doing things that are risk averse to the business. And so even though this looks like a linear progression, it really isn't, right? And so, for example, infrastructure as a service is sitting down there in one of the lower quadrants. And maybe it doesn't always go that way, right? Maybe we started to use AWS. We're using infrastructure as a service. And now that infrastructure is cheap and easy to get, right, we suddenly have hundreds of nodes, dozens of ancillary services, and we need to start wrapping our arms around all of the moving pieces that we need to manage. So maybe that is the gateway action into opening up automation in the larger world of DevOps and continuous delivery practices, right? Or full stack automation is down there below code collaboration. Sometimes if you're automating legacy systems, right, maybe you need to actually wrap your arms around the entire problem domain. Model something that looks like what it is that we're actually managing and get pretty close to setting that as a baseline before you open up for collaboration. So the takeaway from this slide is that it's not necessarily a linear process, but it is a process. And what most people don't tell you about that process is that it's hard. And the reasons why it can be hard is because at every single juncture, as you go down and start going through these phases, you get faced with challenges, and you have to decide, what am I going to do? How am I going to address this challenge? Am I going to do what's easy? Am I going to do what's fast? Right? Am I going to ruffle the fewest feathers, take the path of least resistance? Maybe I'm just going to go work on my little piece of the pie, right? And just fully go to town on that because that's the one thing that I can control and I don't have to collaborate with anyone else, right? And you can choose to do things like that, or you can choose to do what's right. You can choose to go collaborate with other business units or other teams, right? You can start to challenge processes or established workflows. And those things are difficult. They take time. They take additional work. But you can choose to do the right, hard thing. And I particularly love Gannett's story because they have done the right, hard thing. They continue to do the right, hard thing. That's a key principle in their story, and that is a core principle at Chef. So I'm super excited to be able to help introduce a deep dive into how Gannett has fundamentally transformed their IT organization and brought shadow IT into the light. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Frank to tell us the story.
Great. Thanks, George. One of the big things for us was really that we wanted to put forward a cloud platform at Gannett. And that meant more than just a single cloud or more than us just diving into Amazon's infrastructure. But it had a couple of key tenets for us. Most importantly for us ended up being a shared language to speak about deployment. And for us, that was Chef. And that was bringing together our software guys with our operational guys, with our finance guys, with security guys, and just having one way to be actually able to communicate with them. Another thing for us was a homogeneous API. And so we have our data centers, we have for a long time, and we really wanted to be able to break out into the cloud in a meaningful way. And so for us, that meant homogenizing the APIs so that we could deploy our infrastructure the same way no matter where we are so that we could move a little faster. We also wanted to increase the shared responsibility at Gannett, which is it's a big meaningful thing for us to have continuous delivery and fostering the tenets of DevOps and really having teams feel empowered and owning the applications that they're deploying and developing. And the last part for us was leveraging the cloud in an easy way, but also in a responsible way. And that was probably extremely important as we kind of move forward into DevSecOps and things like that. When we started this process, our workflow was a little convoluted, I would say. We started with a build process. We'd publish to our artifact server. We'd look at, does it need to go to the cloud? Does it need to go to an additional artifact server? We'd deploy to another internal CI. We'd tie in some manual testing. The manual testing would go to another environment with more manual testing. And then again, you see manual testing. And I could keep repeating as we go through these, and I think the slide speaks for itself a little bit, but we had a problem with handoffs. And what we ended up with was deployment times and provisioning times that could land anywhere between a few weeks to a few days, depending on whether it's a new application or not. And that was really tough for us to move fast. We'd split our groups up, siloed in our infrastructure and our operations, in 2 physical data centers running and managed by a separate hosting team. And they were separated both physical locations and in the way they rolled up in our org. And for them, they had no cloud presence at all. And these guys were largely locked into the data centers that we owned, and they hadn't really stepped out to do the neat things with Amazon and that some of the other teams are doing. They were also managing deployments into this application that they owned without any access to the development environment, which you can imagine makes things a little hard to have that transition. Our development guys were on the opposite side of that trend. They had internal development servers that they may or may not have been provisioned for their applications, and those would sit inside our data centers. They're using Amazon Classic at the time, just kind of willy-nilly as they deployed things. We had developers spinning up personal Heroku accounts and tying those to production DNS without anybody watching it. It was a bit of a mess. So the other problem there is that we had separate tools because of this. So the network being very segmented didn't allow for us to share the same tool sets between our development guys and the operation guys who were managing the production and stage environments. And there really wasn't any collaboration with the security teams, as you can imagine, if you're seeing that we're in EC2 Classic or Heroku and tying that back into resources that were built into our data center, really without any oversight there. So the problems from this, I think, are pretty apparent from that first slide, is that manual handoffs and different deployment tools caused us some pretty major headaches. And not just in the speed of deployment, because that was slow, but the accuracy of our deployment was really off. And that we got a lot of failed builds from failed handoffs between teams, groups who would execute testing on builds that they shouldn't have been rolling out to begin with. And that was a tough one for us. Accountability to finance and security in cloud. I hear this a lot from the other guys I've talked to, but having them hear things last minute. So the guys who were doing the budget were not necessarily the guys that were spinning up operational costs. The guys who were planning for CapEx were not the guys who were planning for the product that was going to roll out for the next year. And security waited to the end of the conversation, and then they got a notice, hey, we're out in the cloud. It wasn't a great situation for us. We also had the problem of those segregated tools included our monitoring tool suites. So deployment tools and development and operations, none of them shared anything, and that really caused us quite a bit of chaos in our environment. So what did we learn, though? There were some important things that we took out of this, and that we really liked that when we started looking at Amazon, we got really quick time to deploy new applications. When developers stepped out on their own and tossed their Python file or their Ruby code out into Heroku, they were able to get going very quickly. And they were able to expect the same resources every time, no matter what they were doing. And it was really easy for them to access database and cache layers that they didn't need to tap operational resources to get help setting up. That being able to provision it themselves really enabled them to move a lot faster as they went through their life cycle without being stopped up by some of the other teams that we had. And they were also able to scale for the first time outside of the bounds of what we had expensed for that year. So as they begin to move into the mobile world and we started getting peaky traffic, then we noticed that that was a big advantage for us to not have to wait to deploy new resources to scale up these applications. So coming to the table and defining this cloud platform, we really wanted to stop first and define our stakeholders. They were really important to us to carry in not just the development and operation teams, but the finance and security. So we had a few things that we really wanted to tie into them that they cared about. For our developers, they really wanted to deploy and manage their applications with speed and consistency. They were tired of failed builds and Jenkins triggering. They were tired of hearing about bugs that they didn't think were their problem because they didn't own it. Our operation guys wanted a stable infrastructure. And they wanted to build and deploy in a repeatable fashion, and they wanted to manage it in a consistent way across the infrastructure, whether it was on-prem or in the cloud. And finance, they came to us and said, we need to understand the true cost of these applications. So when product comes and tells us they're going to make a whole bunch of money for Gannett by building into our advertising platform, what does it cost to run that advertising platform, be it on-prem or in the cloud? And then finally, security. They really needed a way to audit our existing stacks in the environment and kind of track all of the changes that we had come up with as we started to begin moving at a very quick pace.
So I want to point out here, actually, that this is a really great inflection point, right? This is a place where you've wrapped your arms around the problem domain, right? You see what the lessons are to learn. You know how to move forward. And then you actually go through and get buy-in and consensus from everyone. So can you tell us a little bit more about that process? Or like, what is it that made you think that would work at Gannett? How does that start?
Sure, and it just started by, in some cases, we knew these guys for forever. And so we had some guys who had been on staff with Gannett before there had really been a split of these guys. And part of it was just realizing that we didn't want to have the same conversations over and over again for every single build at deploy time rather than at design time. And so that was for us bringing those guys in, being more conscious about this stuff. And they bit into it in a big way, right? It was the first time anybody had come up to finance and said, hey, what do you care about when we start to deploy at scale? Instead of just going right to developers and saying, how can we solve your problems?
Cool.
So where did we start? And this is a really important thing for us. Is that we had to start somewhere, and really what mattered for us is that we did a grassroots implementation. And this wasn't a top-down, you need to go do DevOps, you need to go do this. It was, hey, we care about what we're doing, we want to go fast, we want to do our job better, what can we do? And for us, it was implementing Chef in a new Amazon VPC, getting out of Classic, and building a development environment to start with that mimicked a true production environment for us. So no longer having that segregated network where things were not reflective of what was actually running, but building things the same way, ground up, in development to match production perfectly. And doing that, we started to standardize our infrastructure and our code and our provisioning processes. And we said, every time you go in, you're going to need to go into this VPC, and you need to be provisioned and deployed through Chef. And that means that when I do it this way to go into development, you're going the same way into production. And we started to increase accuracy. The other thing was security for us was, again, I could touch on this over and over again. Security really wanted to know ahead of time. So what we did is we let them manage mandatory chef controls for user access and system standards, and really started to leverage the infrastructure and the resources being deployed as code to give them visibility into things that they weren't seeing before. So what did we learn from the cloud, right? So this is, when we looked at all the fun things that we had with running in Shadow IT, where we were kind of under the hood and nobody bothered us until we got to a point where we'd made a political mess for somebody, right? We wanted to take all the fun stuff about that and apply it to this cloud platform. And part of that for us was building for failure. And when we got out of the data center and realized that we really shouldn't be building apps that were extremely fragile, because we should plan for failure and we should accept failure in our environment. That really helped, right? Treating infrastructure as code for us was a big one to open up that shared language. We had a whole lot of operational folks who were very knowledgeable, and we had a whole lot of development folks who were very knowledgeable, and they couldn't speak that language to each other, and they didn't know what to ask for when it came time to deploy new applications. And treating that as code really allowed us to check that in and share that in amongst our community of developers and operational folks in-house. And avoiding manual deployment processes. The snake slide that we showed earlier of that mess of deployment needed to go away. We needed to not have manual deployment handoffs if we were going to move at speed. So we built the checks in that we had, and we told them, hey, let's go forward, let's add the integration tests, let's add compliance checks, let's go forward with this in a meaningful way, but take the human gates out of it, and take the handoffs between teams out of it so that the team that's writing the code is really empowered to own that code all the way through the stack. And also for us was separation of concerns and deployment. When we got into this, we were just starting into a microservices architecture. And so important thing for us that we hadn't really done before was gracefully degrade our services as things failed. And it goes back to building for failure, but it was really more than just expecting things to fail, but when network latency is high or when things are slow on another side and you need to be able to rely on that. It was important for us to factor that in as we kind of moved into this environment. So where are we now? This is the big jump for us, and it really kind of shows how much we've grown if you look at kind of where we were. We still have our physical data centers, but we've tied them together. So we have redundant direct connects that connect us to multiple VPCs. We're backing those up with failover VPNs that tie us between our regions. We're connecting peering between our VPCs that we have, so we have network segmentation to make everybody happy. And in that, we have allowed ourselves to build Chef in a way that allows us to access our Chef resources. It doesn't matter if I'm in US West 2 or if I'm in US East 1 or if I'm in my East Coast data center. It's all going to be the same Chef code for us. That availability really spoke to bringing operational folks on board, and they were excited to see that there were ways to implement the network in a way that was highly available for all of our customers to be able to leverage. And we did that by using CloudFormation to tie in the networking teams. So we started to get buy-in from guys who were usually lower in the stack and had done this much earlier in the process before we began to layer on our operational sysadmin folks. So when we talk about introducing security into this cloud platform, we wanted to tie them into Chef itself. So we were very used to writing our integration tests for our Chef code to say, did this actually work? When I get to the end of the deployment, can I actually tell that my server's running the way I expected it? And the big buy-in for us was to say, well, security, we're going to run these tests anyway. What if you go ahead and put in your compliance controls in here so that the things you care about also get tested when we get to the end of this? So what we did was we brought them into the fold and we showed them our server spec tests. And they said, hey, I can write that code. That's real easy for me to read. It should use PAM. Great. And that was a big buy-in for us to get them pulled into this. And it started the conversation with getting them tied into our version control systems and getting them seeing it so early in the process that it hadn't been deployed yet. But before we ended up at a review, before we got into any of the previous process, they could just look in our source control and look at a pull request and say, yeah, that's great.
So I want to point out, actually, that this is also very interesting, right? Because in DevOps and continuous delivery, we talk a lot about test-driven development, right? And that's a core tenet. And so in audit mode, what you're able to do is go through and run these types of security permissions checks. And the thing to realize here is what we're doing is we're now suddenly taking security controls and making them part of our testing cycle, right? It is acceptance testing. We have our unit and functional testing, but as a part of accepting any change and rolling it out to a real-life system, we're going to go through, we're going to check, we're going to make sure that it falls in line with the compliance bits that we need. So you say that you started by taking your server spec tests and handing those over. How was that received by security? Where have they gone with it? How's that
We
process?
gathered all of our security guys in one big room, and we said, look how cool this is. It's going to be so neat when you get here. And they said, why? And I asked them, I said, do you guys know what GitHub is? And most of them said, no. Most of what we track to is looking at our tools. And I said, all right. Well, here's the code I'm working with. And we put this screenshot up there, and they looked at this. And this is exactly what they were looking at when I got buy-in from them, is they were able to read the language that they were writing in Chef. That was the buy-in from them. That was the key, is that this was not some hard foreign thing that they had to learn yet another tool. It was really easy for them to pick up and get started in this and build on what we had already done. And that I only need to add 5 more lines to make this compliant with the way they want it, or I only need to add a few blocks in here to get this to go, rather than have to build an entire cookbook and a recipe to do their compliance.
And that's a key part, what you said right there, right? Building on what you've already done. You went ahead and you showed them the way, right? Sometimes the way that you get buy-in and the way you get folks on your side is you show them the end state. How is this going to work? And lead them there, right? And being able to do that, I think, breaks down those barriers, makes it a lot easier to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing they bought into really good for us was being able to do ticketing and auditing back to change controls in the infrastructure. So if somebody was going to change a security group in one of our instances, we can track that back here. If somebody wants to change IP tables on one of our boxes, they can track that back here. And they get to see when it was done, who it was done by, because we keep all of our master branch current with our production infrastructure.
And I think that one of the things to touch on here, right, is we hear a lot about self-service portals and large IT organizations, right? Setting up enablement, just having a culture of yes, right, where you're not standing in someone's way. And I think security traditionally gets a bad rap for being that culture of no, right? And so what we're doing here is we're giving them a way to be sure that as we're moving, as people are able to do things for themselves, that their concerns are still met. And so I think that's absolutely a 100% correct way to go. That's an amazing approach.
So one of the main key stakeholders, right, as everybody talks about, what does this do for development? Right? And so for us, a couple of key things. Using Scalar, we were really able to leverage the work we had done with Chef. And so we exposed all of our cookbooks in a way that became basically a GUI dropdown to select. When I want to get a new box, I click dropdown and I see all the work that everybody else has done, and I pick the one that applies to me, and I'm off to the races on a new server. And that really kind of broke away from, what do I have to learn to deploy Chef on my box? What do I have to learn to kind of get into this realm of using the new cool stuff that's using? It was go in the GUI and pick what you want. We don't care. And it really simplified deployment for them. We also wanted to let them provision their own resources, but we wanted to put some basically bumpers on the railway for them to go down the bowling alley, right? We wanted to make sure that they're provisioning inside a managed VPC. We don't want to make sure that they're, sitting around waiting on other teams to provision for them. We want them to go when they're ready to go. And being able to leverage the community deployment cookbooks. And I talk a little bit about what's already been done by other folks, but one of the important things is when you want to commit your code, when you want to branch out from what's already been done, we've got these standardized deployment cookbooks, and we let them contribute to that. But we say, if you're going to deploy Python at Gannett, here's a standard way to deploy Python. If you're going to deploy Ruby at Gannett, here's a standard way to deploy Ruby. Here's a way to deploy Node. And we've gone through those technology stacks and really allowed everybody to contribute until we find a way that breaks it down for us to be standardized so that we have that one way to do it.
So this is great. We've shown some advantages for the developers. We've shown some advantage on the operational side, the security side, but there's one big group that needs to be pleased with this platform. And that's why the finance team was part of our initial stakeholder list, right? So we had to show how are we going to visualize these costs for them? How are we going to show them the savings that we're gaining with these costs, right? So, the previous world that they lived in was we had these Uber VMs with 15 or 20 apps on them. There was no way for them to understand and have visibility into what the true application costs are for a given application. So when we went into this mindset with the platform, we're going to go to a single tier model and the microservices layer, and we were going to tag everything that goes out in our ecosystem. So we can truly tell finance, this is your network compute and storage costs for a given application. And that changes the conversation for them when they go into strategy discussions and otherwise, Right? So how do we do this? We use a couple different cost analytics aspects to show these savings. Some of you might be familiar with ICE, developed by Netflix in 2013. We're aggressive with our Amazon reservations. We do them early and often, but we use ICE to show us, hey, where do we need to go out and make additional reservations? The second is Scalar. Scalar is obviously our content management platform, but also gives us a true cost analytics view into the actual costs of our applications, our team structures and projects, and so on and so forth. And so literally, our finance team goes into this, maybe not on a daily basis, but probably on a weekly basis, and understands where are costs being delivered from inside of this new platform. And then also, I mean, it's not only finance that's looking at costs, but we had an interesting thing happen about a month ago. We had one of the developers emailed us and said, yeah, I'm noticing that I rolled a release out, and my costs have really gone up in my farm since that release. And you know, we sort of laugh because how many times have developers asked us how much their farms cost previous to this? You know, they didn't have to worry about that. That wasn't their problem. But with this new model that we're going into, we're holding those teams accountable for the costs that they're delivering from. So it was a really huge step in that conversation occurring inside of our ecosystem was great. And so how are we doing this? This is all enabled by Amazon Detailed Billing, which enables the access into these tools. So this is, I mean, Frank and I could sit up here and tell you, how successful this platform was for Gannett and USA Today, but we wanted to leverage some of the developers that are actually consumers of this platform and talk about, or hear from them what it was like before and after. So we've got a short video here that we're going to jump into.
Prior to the cloud platform, deployments were difficult. We had too much bureaucracy, too many handoffs, too many tickets, depending on people that were not necessarily intricately involved in what you were trying to accomplish in order to get the job done.
My experience onboarding applications before we went to our hybrid cloud platform was horrible. If I could use a couple words to describe it, it would be long-winded, inefficient, and just all around slow.
Also having visibility of the entire pipeline in terms of how the servers are configured, how our app is configured, has allowed us to optimize not only the deployment platform, but the end user experience. So we can turn on features that are really specific to our application without having to worry about breaking other platforms, breaking other teams, and we can speed up everything.
Prior to using Chef as an organization, developers had very little knowledge of how to spin up a box. There was a very big disconnect between development and coding versus infrastructure. It was sort of, the developer would sit down, he would code an API endpoint, for example, and then he would chuck his code over the fence to the DevOps team, and he would wash his hands of it until they get it up and running. With Chef, with the introduction of Chef, again, we've empowered developers to understand how to spin up a box, how to deploy your code, and this helps with timelines, and also it helps with getting developers the know-how and the understanding of what they need to create these applications and make sure that the applications are sitting on boxes that will suffice for their needs.
John Dietz, platform architect with a specialty on deployments.
Josiah McCann, and I'm the principal mobile developer at Gannett Digital.
Jay Merrifield, I'm a principal developer at Gannett.
Alon Motro, and I'm the manager of the Content Platform Services team.
So we actually had to really cut down the edits on what it was like for them to explain what it was like before this platform went into place. They were really going on and on. We were like, okay, we got enough sound bites, it's fine. But I mean, these guys obviously are very positive with the comparison between where we were, and where we're at now. So certainly considered an extreme success from a Gannett standpoint. So how do we measure that success that we're delivering, right? So you heard it mentioned up there as far as how long it took to deploy codes. I mean, sometimes weeks, a lot of times, and most of the time days. Those are down to minutes now. And granted, they're double-digit minutes rather than single digits where we want to go, but that is a huge, awesome step for us there. So we really met how fast can we push stuff out? And secondly, with pushing stuff out that quickly, are we making sure we're doing that in a reliable manner? And the big step for us there is that we deploy everything the same way to production as we are doing that in the lower environment. So all of our testing that's occurring from a deployment side of things and a code standpoint is occurring all throughout those lower environments. Being able to do things with Chef also has been, it has increased, we've mentioned a couple times up already, but has increased the effectiveness and the speed of our development cycle. So, you know, I make reference to it internally as I call it the Gannett community, sort of envision an open source community, but just with Gannett. We've been able to really use the economies of scale that Chef gives us to move quickly across the board. So development team X is using a new technology. They write their Chef cookbook and push that out. Development team Y comes along, ends up using the same technology or chooses that same technology. That cookbook's already in place and they're able to run extremely quickly. So has certainly empowered that. And then as far as what we're able to track and audit, we're doing everything by code inside this new platform. So the visibility that we have to any changes that are occurring inside this platform is dramatically different. And obviously has increased the visibility for our security teams and our operational teams and others.
So what comes next for us at Gannett, right? So one of the big things for us is an iterative process where we're not perfect. We're getting better as we go, and I hope we always continue to get better and don't ever consider ourselves resting on our laurels or really happy with what we've done because we want to move forward. So coming forward for us next is complete enterprise adoption. So we're roughly at about 30% of our teams onboarded right now. And hopefully we can target 100% adoption by our teams in the technology division very shortly coming up, hoping to close either at the end of the year or into next quarter. We're moving fast for this. The other big thing for us was improving our Chef deployment pipeline. A big thing for us as we start to move into this infrastructure is being able to do these things on disposable infrastructure and toss it away and get a new one every time. So we want to increase the speed of our Chef runs in the environment. And so we're doing things like checking in our Chef handlers and removing compilers from applications that are still running that and tuning the code to make sure that we're not looping over things or doing Chef server searches in a way that's duplicating effort. And then migrating early adopters who moved onto this platform very early on out of the initial roles that they had into role cookbooks for us and pinning those versions so that we can lock the environment and really enable integration testing at a higher level.
So before we get into, we have some time for a quick Q&A. Before we get into that, Frank, do we have any backlog items? That we
I mean, a few things.
There's a couple things there. So we are actively bringing on top talent, to continue this effort and to help drive us forward. So certainly always open for conversations there. We certainly have some time left now. We can open it up for any Q&A here. Also, you can catch us after the session too.